Thank you everyone for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Zeynep Celik is Distinguished Professor of Architecture at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Her publications on urbanism and architecture in colonial context are numerous and include The Remaking of Istanbul, Portrait of an Ottoman City in the 19th Century, Urban Forms and Colonial Confrontations, Algiers under French Rule, and Empire Architecture and the City, French-Ottoman Encounters 1830 to 1914, which won the Society of Architectural Historians Spiro Kostov Book Award in 2010. Trained as an architect, Zeynep is a versatile scholar with very wide-ranging interests. She has also written extensively about topics such as collection and display. Among volumes in that sphere, one could cite Displaying the Orient, Architecture of Islam at 19th Century World's Fair, and the book she co-edited with Zeynep Bahrani and Ethem Eldem, Scramble for the Past, a story of archaeology in the Ottoman Empire, 1753-1914. Professor Celik has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, including the Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship and several American Council of Learned Society fellowships. But most of all, Zeynep is an exciting scholar who seems to love her subjects deeply and makes those of us who read her think about them in new and very imaginative ways. Please join me in welcoming Zeynep Celik.
Got this thing dangling. Give me a minute, a second. Oh, I see. Complicated. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. My first time at your university, actually. And I've never talked in front of an audience who knows so much about archaeology. So I will be saying some obvious things in the beginning. Bear with me, and then I'll move on to more esoteric stuff, I hope. Now, I'm going to try to look at several themes in the history of archaeology which have not been so popular by scholars until recently. I will be focusing on the Middle East in the late 19th, early 20th century, namely the lands included within the borders of the late Ottoman Empire. The issues I will raise are not isolated and innocent details within the archaeological discourse. They are packed with political meanings. They reflect imperial power struggles and the ideological mindsets of the time. And as you will see clearly, they bear tremendous consequences that extend to the present day. Okay. You know very well that the history of archaeology has commonly been told through heroes. Learned and scientific-minded Western men who undertook difficult travels to primitive places where they discovered antique treasures, not understood and appreciated by local people who were always very startled at the discovery of these ancient artifacts with whom they've lived all their lives for centuries. Nonetheless, the science of archaeology was not particularly scientific, especially in the mid-19th century. It produced fanciful scenes such as the palaces of Nimrud, reconstructed, or shall we say imagined, by Augustin Henry Layard and drawn by James Ferguson. The image comes from the immensely popular book, The Monuments of Nineveh. I could cite many other such examples. Meanwhile, a careful look at the ignorant natives deemed so unappreciative of the past may allow for more complicated arguments. One case study will hopefully open a perspective on what Yanis Hamilakis coined as indigenous archaeologies. And my case study here, very briefly, is Palmyra. Describing the ruins of Palmyra in the 1780s, Constantin François Volney noted in the courtyard of the Temple of Baal a spectacle which he considered even more interesting than the temple for a philosopher. I'm quoting Volney. In these sacred ruins, showing the magnificence of a powerful and refined people, there are about 30 mud huts, where as many peasant families live in misery. All the industry of these Arabs depends on cultivating a few olive trees and a little wheat that they need for living. All their richness has been reduced to a few goats and a few sheep which they graze in the desert. The glory of the past civilization, associated with the foundations of European civilization, and the misery of the current village inhabited by backward people, presented a powerful dichotomy. In the following decades, other European visitors repeated Volney's observations, and photographers documented the site, exposing a rather picturesque general view. The overall layout adhered to an order, with some straight streets, the main streets of the village. The awareness and appreciation of the unique setting in which the peasants placed their village can be glimpsed in the axial relationship of one street, qualified as a mean street by a traveler in 1916, to an entrance of the temple. You see the relationship quite obvious clearly here. But there was also a decision to remain on the lower level, likely stemming from a desire not to intrude with the monumentality of the ruins. Many of the houses, more like wasps' nests than any other thing, according to the same traveler, had walled gardens and decorative details. You can see it here. Examining these images against the background of travelers' observations unravels a village which is proud of its location, its connection to history, and which is able to reach a harmony between the forms of the past and its own aesthetic traditions. In an argument that's very much alive today, European scholars insisted that the historic treasures had nothing to do with the unworthy cultures and the societies where they stood, but belonged to the Western civilization. The scramble of antiquities that accompanied this line of thought gave way to the transportation of many important pieces to European museums, with ongoing sagas that you know very well. It is in reaction to the European interest in antiquities that the Ottoman state began to own up the antiquities in its extended territories and set forth the principles for an all-encompassing policy. What I'm showing you on the screen is a painting by Saint-Hilaire from 1789. Saint-Hilaire had accompanied Choiseul-Gouffier, who was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and who wrote a book of everything, complicated things, and he illustrated Choiseul-Gouffier's work. Now, what we see here is a lovely view of Istanbul, and in fact, in the museum where it's exhibited in Istanbul, the title says "A View of Istanbul." But in the foreground, we witness the antiquities being loaded to a boat under the supervision of a French man, who is right here. See the antiquities there, they're going to that boat. Such a story could not have happened 100 years later. But in 1789, it was out in the open on the docks of Istanbul like this. Now, to explain the shifts in the Ottoman vision, let me quote a document from 1868, an Ottoman document. And I try to keep the roughness of the language here. It's not my broken English. Don't think my English is so broken. But here is the document, which says, "It is known to all that there are more antiquities held in the Ottoman domains than in other lands. And the fact that the museums of Europe are filled and decorated with antiquities, generally taken from here, is evident proof of this argument. In order to benefit from the useful and valuable knowledge that antiquities have given as a gift to human history, for a long time the civilized states have been gradually correcting their shortcomings by opening museums. And it is clear that it should not be acceptable that we should still not have a museum. And that if this state of affairs is allowed to continue any longer, it is evident that those places where it is hoped that antiquities will be found and that have not yet been searched will also be excavated, and all the valuable, important, and rare objects that they contain will gradually be extracted and transported away." And here is the document. With this declaration, the Ottoman Empire took a decisive step toward the drafting of laws that regulated the excavation and collection of antiquities, and became a major actor in the field of archaeology. A series of laws were passed in 1874, 1884, and 1906, increasingly exerting control over the work of foreign archaeologists and putting them under the strict scrutiny of Ottoman authorities. The laws were first restricted, then entirely banned the exportation of antiquities, a situation that understandably caused great unhappiness in the European and American archaeological community. The main protagonist of all this activity was Osman Hamdi Bey, an intellectual and an artist with a twist on Orientalist painting. Osman Hamdi is a vast topic in himself, and a great deal of work has been done on him, especially during the past 2 decades. His art is debated with passion, and his paintings are worth fortunes. I feel I should open a quick parenthesis here to say a couple of words on Osman Hamdi's art in reference to 2 of his paintings. The first, a harem scene on top, conveys his utilization of the Orientalist genre as well as his revisions, his corrections to it in order to convey a different message on Ottoman society. In this case, he makes a commentary on women of the harem by portraying them as respectable human beings, fully clothed and engaged in household chores, as opposed to the typical sex slaves of artists such as Jean-Léon Gérôme at the bottom. He thus speaks back to the Orientalist school by using its very own language. In the second work, he does the opposite by orientalizing an archaeological site. The site is Nippur. Nippur is in Mesopotamia, as you know, and I'll come back to it. The painting was done from a photograph, literally duplicating it. Osman Hamdi dotted the image with color, emphasizing its picturesque quality by highlighting the human figures who are the workers in the photograph. Yet the workers are hardly working in the Ottoman artist's canvas. In the background, a file of men seem to suggest labor, but those in the foreground are sitting, squatting, watching, and reiterating the popular concept of the lazy Arab, so prevalent in the discourse of the time. and this is a watercolor by Robert Baalbek. Under the leadership of Osman Hamdi, who served as the director of the Imperial Museum in Istanbul, Ottomans also started to carry out their own excavations, most notably in Sidon and Nemrut'ta in southeastern Anatolia. Their work methods were not any different than their Western colleagues. Furthermore, Ottoman archaeologists shared the overall visions of their foreign colleagues in their perceptions of local people as ignorant, irrational, and childlike others, thereby doing away with the East-West dichotomy on that upper intellectual level. A widely reproduced photograph of Osman Hamdi in Nemrut'ta epitomizes this position, with the archaeologist, the learned man carefully clearing the antiquities, the worker behind him reduced to a static, primitive sculpture of sorts. Other photographs taken by Hamdi Bey underline the otherness paradigm in a semi-ethnographic documentary mood. The famous sarcophagi found in Sidon created the impetus to build a new and modern museum building in 1891 in Istanbul, across from the 15th century kiosk used to house the antiquities until then. The sarcophagi, especially the one wrongly attributed to Alexander the Great, attracted a great deal of international attention, facilitated by a scholarly publication by Osman Hamdi titled Une nécropole royale à Sidon. The well-preserved colors of the sarcophagus shifted the ongoing debates on polychromy in ancient Greek art. If the statues of the kings in Nemrut'ta were too huge to bring to the Ottoman capital, the museum was filled with pieces from the extensive imperial territories and had to be enlarged twice, turning from a linear structure into a U-shaped one with two wings, the last one added in 1908, and here you see the earlier kiosk. The appropriation of antiquities did not remain on the official level and penetrated late Ottoman culture in many ways. We observe it in literature. For example, in a romantic novella by Ali Kemal, titled An Adventure in the Desert and published in 1894, the little book on the left. Ali Kemal, who, by the way, is the great-grandson of the current mayor of London, another story. Ali Kemal used the ruins in Palmyra metaphorically as an emotional and psychological backdrop for the exploration of the inner world of its protagonist, a young woman from Istanbul. A painting by an army officer named Ahmet Emin on the right, titled Ruins of Baalbek, conveys the fascination of the Ottoman artists with the ruins. In one striking example, antiquity was revived visually to exercise perhaps the most tragic episode in late Ottoman history, the persecution of Armenians. Zabel Boyajian presents Armenia during idealized and peaceful times in paintings made to illustrate her book titled Armenian Legends and Poems. And the date of the book is 1916, right after the 1915 genocide. For this purpose, Boyajian used details borrowed from newly excavated Assyrian and Babylonian sites, including Assyrian artworks depicting ancient Urartu, which was then beginning to be identified with an Armenian past. So here we have an Armenian artist born in the Ottoman city of Diyarbakir in southeastern Anatolia, who is citing antiquity as a mythic golden age. Up until this point, I talked about some new questions in the historiography of archaeology we addressed in a recent book I edited with Zeynep Bahrani and Ethem Eldem. Felipe mentioned it. The book is titled Scramble for the Past, A Story of Archaeology in the Ottoman Empire, 1753 1914, 1753 corresponding to the opening of the British Museum. 1914 is the date when the Museum of Islamic Arts was opened in Istanbul. While we believe that we contributed to the opening up of the field, we also realized how incomplete the picture still is and how much more research needs to be done to understand the intricacies of the topic. What I will discuss in the remaining part of my presentation is drawn from my new research that attempts to expand the field further. A chapter that has been conspicuously absent from histories of archaeology is the landscape of labor. Archaeological work always depended on a large labor force drawn from local populations and that could reach seasonally to hundreds of workers every day. The relationship between the archaeologists and field workers was intimate, even though history only talks about archaeologists. Yet archaeologists themselves conveyed much information on their relationships with the natives and mundane quotidian events on excavation sites. From Austin Henry Layard to Hormuz Rassam to John Pernod Peters and Osman Hamdi Bey, they mixed the accounts of their work with ethnographic and anthropological data, mostly in anecdotal, but sometimes in a semi-scholarly manner. Read against the grain of their imperial and orientalist mindsets, these accounts help envision a social history of excavations, hopefully restoring some overdue recognition to the multitude of people ever present in the documents, textually and visually. In photograph after photograph, laborers appear carrying out their tasks as individuals and in groups. Often the scene gives us dynamics of the relationships on the sites. A turn-of-the-century frame from Babylon displays the plurality of the characters involved in the operations. 3 Europeans, a committee of German scientists in white costumes, are here, as well as an Ottoman officer. You see him there? And then, of course, we have the workers. Here, I should perhaps give some background to the increasing Ottoman supervision. Commonly, if permanent inspectors could not be sent to a site, the directors of education, the highest officers of the Ministry of Education in the provinces, were held responsible for keeping an eye on the activities of foreigners. They had to report to the ministry. However, as the officers' headquarters were away from the excavation site, they could not successfully carry out their duty. Consequently, the net was cast much wider, and by 1900, civil service personnel, such as governors and district head officials, as well as high school principals, in larger settlements, middle school teachers in smaller towns, and police and gendarmerie officers were all held responsible for controlling foreign archaeological activity. Hence, by the end of the century, the social dynamics of archaeology had become intricate in its grouping. Foreign archaeologists, Ottoman administrators, all these supervisors, and local laborers, each keeping a close eye on the other for different reasons. The photograph testifies well to this complicated structure. Meanwhile, it also features a bit of technology in the form of rail lines. The workers push the carts under the eyes of the overseers. The distance between the carts attesting to serial and efficient organization and evoking a factory-like production. Much more is going on in the background. Let me now turn to two sets of images. Upon some reflection, the scientific and neutral-looking section on top from Hamdi Bey's Sidon excavation metamorphoses into a story about labor. The drawing shows one sarcophagus being pulled on rails out of a low and narrow cave. The delicate nature of the work called for slow and careful work. We can thus easily imagine how the workers, photographed at the mouth of the cave in a moment of triumph, had spent long hours in the heat and dark in uncomfortable postures. The first director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Luigi Palma di Cesnola's account of digs in wells 40 to 50 feet underground in Golgoy, Cyprus from 1878, is accompanied by a chilling image, which triggers the viewer to empathize with the horror of working in this pit for 15 hours, as stated by the archaeologists. We feel the fatigue, pains, thoughts, and sentiments of the man in the hall if we push ourselves a little bit. And this Cesnola seems to provoke a deliberate frisson in his readers. The sectional drawing is complemented by a cluster of instruments used in the operation. The caption underlines the message, how tombs are excavated and with what tools. Attempting to bring the barefoot man pushing the cart in Babylon, the ones in the pits in Sidon and Golgoy, and many others to the foreground of archaeological expeditions, I will take some methodological risks in interpreting the textual and visual documentation as I try to decipher archaeologists' gaze on natives and natives' gaze on archaeologists. I will focus on one case study, Nippur, which was excavated between 1889 and 1900 in 4 seasons by scholars associated with the University of Pennsylvania, namely John Pernod Peters, Herman Volrath Hilprecht, and John Henry Haynes. Nippur is to the west of Divaniye. Let me show you where Nippur here. Here's Divaniye. Nippur is here. The other main settlement nearby is Hilla. Now, Hilla and Divaniye provided the Americans with basic services ranging from mail and telegraph, ranging from food supplies to security forces, and connected them to the rest of the world through mail and telegraph, benefits of the fragmented Ottoman modernity in Iraq. You have views of Divaniye here. In contrast, Nippur was in the midst of a barren countryside with nothing around it but the ruins. We are cut off from civilization, Peter wrote in his diary, by the long stretch of the desert and marsh. Upon their arrival in Nippur on their first expedition, 1889, the archaeologists pitched their tents on the highest point to the southwest of the ruins. According to Haynes, the site had great advantages: unobstructed views of the swamps and the desert, protection from malaria, he was wrong in that, and possibly from possible attacks from the Arabs. A number of facilities were built around them in a square plan. They included the stables, storerooms, workshops, a kitchen, and a hut for guards. The surrounding architecture, adhered to regional construction techniques outside the compound, an indigenous village which housed the workers grew spontaneously. The second expedition came with a much more disciplined pattern, correcting the mistakes of the previous year. The first was open to hot winds and sandstorms. This one was better protected. The first could not stop the curious Arabs from wandering into the tents of the Americans. This one took measures against such intrusions by design. Huts with various facilities serving the team surrounded the tents. The inner compound in a square plan was protected by open spaces on 4 sides, then separated from the outside world by a 3 feet tall wall. At a considerable distance, Hilprecht's words, but still part of the settlement, was the workers' village in reed and palm leaf architecture around a large open courtyard and neatly lined at right angles. This is a rather unprecedented layout for the region. The archaeologist's compound had only one entrance on the east side, right here. It hence turned its back toward the native compound, enabling the archaeologists, quote, to guard themselves better against treachery. I'm not making this up. They write in these words. The third expedition, 1893-96, engraved the American presence permanently in the landscape by means of a prominent structure. As this expedition would last 2 to 3 years, a proper building was needed. It would ensure better protection from the harsh climate as well as from the thievish inclination of the Arabs, says Hilprecht. Just as significantly, it was meant to broadcast an appearance of strength, conveying a message about the power and status of the archaeological team. Dominating everything else around it, the expedition house attracted much attention and was named the Castle, or the Kala, by the Arabs, a name that Americans adapted. Constructed with local materials and in harmony with the architectural forms of the region, it was inspired by the residences of local families of wealth and status in nearby settlements, for example, by Abdelhamid's castle on the right. This sort of proto-regionalism is an interesting topic which I'm not going to be able to go into here, but I've dealt with it elsewhere. The proximity and the separation of the two settlements, which ran through the different phases of the Nippur expedition, gave way to a complex and shifting relationship between the Americans and the natives. The journals kept by Peters in 1889 and 1890 reflect a telling development from neutral and impersonal records to more engaged ones. Early on, for every entry, he jotted down the numbers of workers on the site, the increase from 30 men, let's say, on February the 7th to 1944, or in March 16th, and reaching to 250 in late January. All of these were meant to express the growing scale of the work. Along the way, Peters described the organization of labor and the division of the workforce into gangs, with each gang structured according to a strict hierarchy reflected in the payments. Peters' journals from late 1890 display a more intimate relationship with the workers, especially the foremen. He gave their names and described their responsibilities and the work achieved by them. He wrote, for example, that Musa el-Jervani had been working for 2 days in the third room of the Hebrew house. Hassan has found that the second of his rooms rests against the steep, step-like wall, and so forth. He drew a plan of the site showing the different locations of excavation, numbering each location and linking the number with the names of the workers, the foremen rather. In area 1, he noted, Hussein Dawood is digging out rooms on the outer face, whereas Daki is digging out rooms on the east of the breach on the inside, and so forth. So what happens is that Arabs become individualized, they become part of the excavation site, and they gain some sort of agency. They're no longer just numbers. During the third and the fourth expeditions, Haynes, the new director, undertook a more systematic ethnographic research and documentation, most likely stemming from the longer excavation seasons. He also benefited from the view of a complete village from the castle, which he could see very clearly from a height. But also the University of Pennsylvania's financial support of photographic documentation. Indeed, the University of Pennsylvania and the Smithsonian endorsed the ethnographic project, as evidenced by a letter from George Brown Good, the Assistant Secretary of the Smithsonian, to William Pepper, the Provost of the university. In this letter, written in 1889, Good urged Peters, then director of the expedition, to send to the museum a costume of a Mesopotamian chief or of his wife or both. He added a wish list. Any illustration of the methods employed in spinning, weaving, dyeing, working with metal or wood would be exceedingly valuable to us. Any musical instruments, especially the cruder and simpler forms, nothing sophisticated, crude and simple. Simple lamps or appliances for making fire or heating would also be immediately available. Good thus outlined a rough research guideline for the archaeologists. Haynes' field notes are speckled with casual observations on the life and customs of the workers. To cite one example, he wrote that the first day of the Muslim feast called Bayram was a day of rejoicing and feasting. It was an occasion for acquiring new costumes or at least one garment. The supremely happy crowd, in his words, celebrated by chanting most lustily their hosas in an improvised manner. Joseph Mayer, the young architect of the expedition, complemented Haynes' accounts with his more informed observations on the music played in the village. In spontaneous notes on the margins of his logbook, he described the songs he heard from the rooftop of the castle in some detail. Likening them to serenades or nocturnes, he stated, "Songs are evening diversions," and continued, "Towards the evening, our Arabs begin to be lively." He believed that music must have served as a relief and relaxation from fatigue at the end of the day, and added that on the excavation site, workers would start a lively chant when making a physical effort, such as pulling a rope and lifting a weight. I found him the most sympathetic character of the team. Unfortunately, he died very early. He had to be transported to Baghdad, and that's where he died. Nevertheless, the ethnographic record in Nippur is most striking in the photographs of the native village taken during the last two expeditions. The indigenous houses, their construction techniques, and their materials constitute a major category in Haynes' photographs. Labeled as building workman's hut, house building in Nippur, houses under construction, and so forth. They covered the construction from the earliest phases, depicting the building of the frame, to the filling in of the walls and covering of the roof, and finally to the finished products. Natives, shown putting their houses together, helped explain the process while giving a sense of scale. One caption outlined the construction process. The architect and chief builder are twisting several moistened flags, or in other words, is making ropes to be used in place of nails to build the parts of the structure together, talking about these vertical elements you see there and then how they're bent to create the structure. Another category is about daily life and depicts the villagers carrying out their authentic activities against the backdrop of their new settlement. Photographs show a group of 3 men weaving baskets, and the third cleans a brace of pistols. A potter working from his hut, and 2 brothers in a sham fight, according to the captions. Women's work centered on food production. They pounded rice to remove the husk from the kernel, and in many views, they prepared meals, squatting on the ground in small groups and using the ovens in the courtyards. An uncharacteristically long and detailed caption focused on one woman patiently building up a storage jar of clay which only requires drying in the sun to complete it for use. Haynes documented festive occasions. In a private celebration, a foreman called Hassan Sahab exhibited his youngest son, only 10 days old, to the community. The women of Haji Tarfa's household in a neighboring village were also identified, not only as members of his harem, but also with their proper names. Fatima was the first wife and the mistress of the harem, and Lira was the youngest of the 3 wives. The middle one was called Hadija, not much qualification. With its crude and simple architecture and lifestyles then, the native village in Nippur was an unlikely cousin of the indigenous villages common to the universal expositions held in Europe and North American cities during the very same years. I'm showing you images from the 1889 exhibition of a native village in Paris, this one. But of course, Chicago had its native villages. Assembled in part as exotic curiosities, in part as ethnographic tableaux vivants, and loaded with notions of civilizational superiority, colonial power, and race thinking, these villages served as platforms to introduce others to European and American crowds. The archaeologists in Nippur, undoubtedly familiar with these extremely popular displays deemed authentic, must have been intrigued and amused in realizing that they had something much better in their front yard. Taking a detour, I will now try to view the camp from the villagers' perspective. The first question that comes to mind is what it must have meant to take on the job. Regular and relatively good pay was undoubtedly a main attraction, despite the seasonal nature of the work. The site was isolated, making lodging and meals difficult and necessitating support from families. The likely anxiety about leaving women and children behind must have also played in moving entire households to Nippur. Once settled, everyday activities seem to have followed familiar patterns of the original villages. The difference for man was in the nature of the work and the long hours on the site. During daytime, the village was occupied only by women and children. The big novelty for the natives must have been the presence of a group of foreigners with unfamiliar customs living in the midst of them, but protected from them by their fortress and by the security forces provided by the Ottoman governor in Divaniye. This image at the bottom shows you Haynes' family traveling, and the 2 guards were given to them by the Ottoman authorities. The curiosity of the workers was evident in their frequent and sneaky visits to the tents during the first two expeditions. As for the Arab-proof castle of the third expedition, at least some workers knew some things about the architectural organizations and the spaces because they had worked on the construction and they served as house help in it. It is most likely they passed the information on to the village residents. Still, life in the Forbidden Castle must have been an infinite source of gossip and speculation, from the simple everyday routines to the manner in which foreigners entertained their guests. The natives had a good idea of the food provisions and the quantities involved. They saw them coming in. But could they peek into a dining party with male and female guests and many courses served, including wines from Syria? What did they think of the archaeologists' cumbersome clothes, their hats, their bicycles? What did they make of Mrs. Haynes, who fit into her own gender-based role at home, but who diligently went to the dig, took field notes as her husband, and mingled in her own curious ways with the workers? I don't know what the photograph at the bottom is all about, but Mrs. Haynes being carried around festively by the natives. How did they react to being photographed by Haynes? Did Haynes show them any photographs or give them copies for keeps? What would an ethnographic record kept by the natives on Americans reveal? Such questions will never be answered, but at least wondering what the silent men, women, and children of Mesopotamia saw on the exhibition site may begin to acknowledge their presence in the history of archaeology. Thank you.
Can you take some questions?
Of course, yes.
We have time for a few questions. If there are any.
Yes.
You focused on the archaeological photography at Nippur, and I wonder if you found that much documentation for the archaeologists. I mean, the actual images of the archaeologists in Haynes's photography, because largely in his photography at Assos, the archaeologists are almost non-existent.
They are non-existent in the photographs of the, I mean, I can't generalize, there may be a few with the archaeologists depicted on the site, but they are conspicuously absent from the scientific documentations. It's very rare that we see the whole dynamics, but there are photographs. Yes?
Well, the archaeologists are venturing into these camps and taking pictures and so forth. Is there any evidence of socializing between, say, the supervisors or even the Ottoman representatives and the archaeologists? Do they have each other to dinner and so forth?
Well, dinner. Now, they had to provide lodging for the Ottoman representatives. And that was a big topic of complaint. And I think the Ottomans were very unhappy living among them too. So there is quite a bit on that. As to the foremen, they developed friendly relationships. Some were preferred. You see those in the journals of the archaeologists, and that's what I mean by saying when I said that they didn't, from numbers, they became human beings. And the archaeologists would also try to take part in their festivities. So there was human contact, no doubt.
Right. Thank you.
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for a wonderful
Thank you.
talk. I love the way you raised the issue of increasing legislation and control over which sites were being selected. And I wonder in that if you saw patterns in the types of sites and if there's any legislation of the labor that you directed our attention to.
In the laws, there are no stipulations about labor. These are done by individual agreements between various teams. So the laws are very general. However, the intricacies are worked out on a one-to-one basis. I have to say that there is a difference between deals with Europeans and Americans. Americans are very clever, and it's also late in the game. They come with money, and they say, we're in it for science, for scientific reasons. We're going to give everything we find to the museum. And we are very critical of Europeans taking stuff out. It's a very clever strategy. And they have cooperated very nicely with Osman Hamdi, who was watching over them with eagle eyes. Yeah.
The enlargement of the Museum of Islamic Art is very dramatic, isn't it? Is there any information as to whether this was primarily to cater to European tourists, or whether this was primarily directed towards the population of Istanbul, the educated population of Istanbul who would then visit it? And I've also got one other little question. So how does the development of museums in Istanbul compare, for example, with what was going on in Tunis or other North African museum developments?
Okay, let me start with the second one. Of course, the Ottoman Empire is not a colony, as Tunis was. So the museum building in North African colonies of France are really French policies. It's a very different story. I don't think it is fair to compare it. Perhaps more interesting is to look at the Imperial Museum in Istanbul in a comparative way with the Metropolitan Museum of Art as being two. No, I'm doing that in my book. There are two institutions outside the European establishment, and they have similarities, and they are very aware of each other. The Metropolitan, I'm sorry, I'm repeating myself, Philippe and Corey. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has a lot of money, but no antiquities. The museum in Istanbul is sitting on all the antiquities, but has no money. So that, I think, makes a very interesting comparison. As a scientific museum, the Istanbul Archaeology Museum was pretty far out for its time. But very elitist museum, that's another story. And what was your first question?
Well,
Islamic art.
So to which population were they catering?
Very good question. And this is where the difference is tremendous. You see the Metropolitan Museum of Art having all these public education programs, opening its doors to everybody. I got very angry at Osman Hamdi Bey as I was doing the research, because he basically created a museum for himself and his refined Western colleagues. It changes. Once the museum is there, schools start visiting and newspapers write about it, so he can't keep it in his pocket for his favorite buddies. But there is a difference in the visitors. And the catalogs. It's a big story, but it's a very good question. As to the Islamic Museum of Art, I don't think they catered, they were thinking too much. This is after Osman Hamdi's death. It's his brother who starts the Museum of Islamic Arts. It's sort of ridiculous, isn't it? 1914, the other museum goes way back, and by the time they started considering their own, the other is their own too, but the Islamic heritage, it took all those years. And that has a lot of ideological and cultural prejudices behind it. In some ways, Osman Hamdi and the intellectuals of that time were trying to prove how European and how civilized they were, and that could only be done by having a museum of antiquities. A museum of Islamic art would not do it for them. That's very simply putting it. Yes?
I've read some work on archaeological photography in India and slightly later period by someone whose name I can't now remember, but he was talking about sort of strategies of surveillance on site, as you referred to. But he made some points about how workers were used as like sort of human scales frequently, or they were the ones pointing, or. I mean, is that
oh, yeah.
a regular trope?
They do it all the time, human scale, but then you have such a big topic. You have this poor Arab Bedouin standing as scale, but he has a spear in his hand. Why would he have a spear in his hand? Because he fits the stereotype like that. The fighting Arab.
As scale.
Yeah. So it's all mixed up, and it is very interesting. Yeah.
Zeynep, could I ask a question?
Go ahead.
So you've been working on these topics for several years, and I guess my question is there a way to communicate this other than academic books? I mean, can you tell this story in Istanbul museums? Or is there a way to tell this story more
to
broadly?
The public,
yeah.
broadly. With other colleagues, we would love to do that. But how do you do it? We tried to do an exhibition. We were not very pleased with the result. The exhibition happened in Istanbul, but it was an unhappy adventure for us. We did not think we conveyed the message at the end. If anybody would be interested, we would be delighted to make it more popular. How do you make it popular? Websites? I don't know. Who looks at websites? I think sometimes museums do very, very nice exhibitions that reach large publics. Should I write a novel? I wish I had the talent. I wish I had the talent to write a novel about these people.
Mrs. Haynes.
The scandalous Mrs. What are they thinking? But I still think, even to ask the question, what are they thinking when they look at this? What is that bicycle doing there?
Were there any pets? Were there any pets? I mean,
yes, there were pets. Yes, they had a vegetable garden. If you can imagine, Nippur, they had a vegetable garden, and they document how the lettuces grew and not very much. And it's interesting. And we know how many lambs were delivered every week, and they ate 4-course dinners. They had guests and all the wine coming from Syria.
I'm curious because I'm not quite sure where the project is. Is the project about perceptions of each other? And I mean, I think it's, it's so rich, right? We see these kind of Orientalist tropes being played out, but in these kind of very nuanced ways. Or is the project about labor?
It's both.
And so if the labor piece is in there, I'm wondering where illicit labor might fit into this, right? Those who are out there treasure hunting.
Oh, yes.
There's a long tradition, at least in Arabic literature, of these treasure hunting manuals, and I'd assume there's something similar that's happening in Ottoman as well. So I'm wondering how that piece of it might fit into this, and how that plays into some of these tropes about the thieving Arabs, about this need to be guarded against the native inhabitants.
It's a very good question, and I deal with it in my book, which is coming out next year. However, I think this is a very important question. I did not talk about the labor. You know, we know quite a lot about how much they get paid, how they're organized, and so forth. Who are the foremen? The foremen are the people who worked for antique dealers in the region because they know how to dig. They know better how to dig than the archaeologists. So they go to them right away. And then they have to keep an eye on them because they're used to making a lot of money in illicit digging. They are very complicated, these relationships. So to build that kind of relationship, okay, you're not going to take it to the certain. They knew the dealers, so it was very easy for them to divert, and they probably did anyway. But that's really, and also they make sure that the foremen employ men from their region. So there's a whole kind of social structure in the labor landscape.
I'm curious about the worker settlements, because anthropological studies have shown that where you get spontaneous settlements, usually refugee camps, structure emerges. You get governing councils, you get headmen, whatever. And I don't know whether these places were too small and too ephemeral for that to have happened or whether people recorded it, but I'm wondering if there was any recorded structure regarding these.
I wondered about that too, because, you know, I did some work on squatter settlements.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of whether there was some sort of, I couldn't find any documentation. They're also seasonal.
Yeah, well, as I say, they're ephemeral
Yeah,
and small.
so ephemeral, so they come and go, and they came back and rebuilt their houses. And I don't know, are they, and they didn't keep records, of course.
Probably
Yeah.
illiterate.
They're illiterate. They didn't keep journals.
Shame on them.
Shame on them, yes.
One more.
Elizabeth.
You said they didn't keep journals, but were there people, how far down the social ladder would you, or how far up the social ladder would you have to go in order to find information from the subaltern population?
Okay. In the Ottoman archives, we have some documents, for example, reports sent by teachers to Istanbul. And that's as low as it gets in the higher. Of course, there are, and sometimes there are big complaints from the people who are working, who are supervising, and telegraph makes everything very easy at that time. So there is communication, but that's as far as I found, and it is not even in Arabic, it's in Turkish, those documents.
Please join me in thanking.
Thank you so much.